Both sides are attempting to bridge significant differences on fishing, competition policy and how any deal would be enforced. The British government says it's prepared to leave the transition period without agreement. But Ireland's foreign minister says a deal is 98% complete and is now more likely to be reached than not. Well, let's bring in Tony Waterman, who's in Brussels for us. Hello there, Tony. Now, a little bit of deja vu here, but this is about more than ironing out a few creases. Has progress been made today?
You're right. This is really a do-or-die moment. The UK chief negotiator, David Frost, arrived in Brussels around lunchtime today. He went directly into meetings, and it's understood there are about a dozen officials on either side trying to work out what is right now the most intractable issue, and that is around the level playing field, ensuring that there is fair competition between UK and EU businesses when the end of the transition period comes around at the end of the month. The EU is concerned that there could be divergences when it comes to standards around the environment, around labor in the future, and it wants the power to impose tariffs if such divergences take place. The UK sees this as a de facto way of keeping it aligned with EU regulations. The EU also would like to see Downing Street appoint a regulator to scrutinize and approve any sort of state subsidies before the money starts going out to companies. This is how it's done in the EU, but again, the UK sees this as breaching its sovereignty. These talks have been at an absolute stalemate since Friday, when negotiations were forced to be stopped. Yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had a phone conversation. It lasted just about an hour. This was not a conversation about negotiating, but rather reiterating these red lines. One thing they did agree to, though, of course, is to give it one final push, or rather maybe a shove, to try to get this over the finish line. Michel Barnier, he's the EU chief negotiator. He's going to be briefing EU ambassadors tomorrow morning. And then Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson are going to have another phone call tomorrow evening to see if there are any sort of landing zones from this negotiation after the chief negotiators meet in Brussels today.
Tony Waterman in Brussels, thanks very much for that update. I'd like to bring in Dr. Lee Jones now. He's a reader in international politics at Queen Mary University of London, and he joins us now. Dr. Lee, what's at stake for the EU if no deal is reached?
Well, the EU will obviously suffer some economic disruption, but that'll be much more spread across multiple EU economies, whereas on the UK side, the disruption will be very concentrated in one economy. So obviously, in the short term, at least, the EU will suffer less disruption. But some industries will certainly be disrupted if there's no deal at the end of the month.
And what about for Britain? If there's no deal reached, what's at stake for Britain and the British economy?
Well, obviously, any trade with the continent would be disrupted, subject to potentially lengthy checks at the borders and so on. And the various estimates have put this at approximately £40 billion in extra costs, which obviously is quite significant, although many estimates of the cost of Brexit have been probably a bit over-exaggerated, and of course that will pale into insignificance against the costs of the lockdowns related to COVID-19.
So a little bit of number crunching still to do, but it sounds like whichever way it goes, Brexit is going to be expensive for everyone. Now, former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown, he's been saying that there are huge international implications of failing to reach an agreement. So how could no deal impact maybe other trade deals that the UK will be looking to do with, say, the USA?
Well, I mean, I think this is kind of Remainer histrionics, if you like. Gordon Brown suggesting that there's going to be an economic war between the UK and the EU and between the UK and the US. I mean, this is nonsense. The vast majority of states in the world trade with the European Union on World Trade Organization terms. And the vast majority trade with the United States on WTO terms as well, as does the EU. So just because a trade deal isn't reached doesn't mean that there's going to be economic war, or that the international trading system is going to freeze up overnight. I think this is just basically nonsense. I mean, clearly there's an inflection point in the international system at the moment, which some people are starting to call deglobalization. The COVID crisis in particular has seen people recognise the difficulty of relying on transnational supply chains and global value chains, the difficulty with securing your own national society and your own supplies of key equipment. So there's already attempts to sort of shorten supply lines and become more self-sufficient in certain strategic goods, which is probably a good thing overall. But for kind of globalist-oriented elites like Gordon Brown, maybe Joe Biden, for example, this is bad. This is globalization going into reverse. It's the opposite of what they've promoted for most of their careers.
Well, Boris Johnson and his government have been criticised for just those things that you're saying. What about EU member states when we're hearing that France has threatened to use its veto when it comes to these negotiations? What are the red lines on both sides?
Well, this is the fundamental difficulty that you're picking up on, which is that the negotiating positions have never been compatible from the beginning. So the UK wants to be treated like any other sovereign state. It wants to maintain control over its own laws and its own territory, including maritime territory, and it wants to negotiate access to the single market. But for the European Union, as your reporter was just saying, they want to keep the UK subordinated to EU laws and regulations and also to EU courts to police the agreement. And it seems that they simply cannot allow Britain to emerge as a major independent economy on the borders of the European Union. They don't want that. And so they want to keep the UK locked into the EU orbit as much as possible. And so they've been determined to make it very difficult for Britain to leave the EU in the first place and then to get a Canada-style trade deal with the European Union by imposing restrictions on the UK that no other sovereign state has ever been subjected to and no sovereign state in its right mind would agree to. So I'd be very surprised if there is a deal. I mean, the European Union has got a habit of sort of pulling the rabbit out of the hat at the 11th hour and fudging through a deal. But the two sides are really quite fundamentally far apart. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was now no deal.
So no surprise if there's no deal. They're far apart. The EU wants to keep the UK, will make it as difficult as possible for the UK to leave the EU, probably because they don't want anyone else to do it either. Well, Dr. Lee Jones, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.